Way back when I was about 8 or 9 years old, I remember having a conversation with my dad about religion and God and stuff. At one point in the conversation, I have this really vivid memory of a question I asked and the answer he gave me. The question was something like, do angels really exist? And his answer went something along these lines. Before I was born, before Mum and he were even an item, my dad used to drive trucks for a living. This was way back before labour laws restricted brakes or mile limits, so Dad would sometimes take jobs that required him to drive for maybe 24 or even 36 hours straight. One particular night, after having already driven for a really long time, he noticed his eyelids getting heavier and heavier as he got sleepier and sleepier. Even worse, any attempt to wake himself up just didn't seem to be working. He chugged down the rest of his coffee, tried blasting himself with cold air from the AC, but nothing did the trick. He says he remembers passing mile marker 146, and since he had this straight stretch of road in front of him, he decided to rest his eyes and take a deep breath for maybe only 2 seconds tops. Then the next thing he knows, he feels his head do the nod jerk thing, which woke him up with a gasp. He opened his eyes to see that he was driving straight toward mile marker 158, which was right up against some ravine type thing. If he had woken up a second later, his whole truck would have plummeted down the ravine, and he'd have surely been killed. But because he came to at that exact moment, he was able to safely course correct. He says if the difference between life and death came down to literally just a second, I actually wouldn't even exist right now. Once he stopped, he just pulled to the side of the road the first chance he could and did the math on the whole thing. He said he must have slept through miles of driving down a perfectly straight highway, doing anything between 50 and 60 miles an hour, only to wake up right at the moment he needed to in order to save his own skin. It was a really long-winded way of saying that he didn't actually know if angels really existed, but he sure believed they did. Either that or there was some kind of force in the universe that woke him up just as he reached mile marker 158 at the exact split second that he needed to. Because as I already said, if he'd nodded off a millisecond later, or nodded himself awake a millisecond later, I wouldn't be writing this right now. I just want to start off by saying what a huge fan of your channel I am. I drive trucks for a living, and most of my journeys are long haul, which means I have plenty of time to just sit in my cab doing a whole lot of nothing. As you can probably guess, it gets really boring, and if it wasn't for all the videos you put out, I think I'd have gone straight up crazy by now. I don't really have a lot of free time whenever I'm home, so it's taken me way longer to write this than maybe it should, but I've been meaning to share something that happened to me with you for the longest time now, and I think it would be awesome to hear one of my own experiences on one of your videos. A few years ago, I was cruising west about 70 on the I-76 just outside of Denver, Colorado. It had been a pretty boring haul up until that point. I mean, Colorado was pretty and all, but the whole drive had been completely uneventful. The weather had been great, there had been nothing to slow me down, and I was starting to think the whole ride would carry on without a hitch. But then, out of nowhere, I see this huge, almost solid cloud of dirt coming over the horizon. It had to be at least 20 to 30 feet wide, completely covering the road ahead, and it was at least as tall as my truck's cab, so maybe 12 to 15 feet tall. At first, I had no idea what I was looking at. Could have been a vehicle fire or something, but then I couldn't see the smoke billowing from anywhere, and I couldn't see any car or truck either. Then I figured it might have been like a dust storm or something, but a dust storm that's only 30 feet wide. It couldn't be. I didn't have any way of dodging it, so I just slowed down, hit the washers, then just prayed that there weren't any rocks getting whipped up that might smash my windshield. I'm an owner and operator too, so any damage and it's my insurance, not some company's. Seconds later, wham! I hit it, and the noise in my cab was seriously loud. That's what set it apart from a regular dust storm. They just don't make that kind of noise. Then the second thing that set it apart from a dust storm was the mess it left on my windshield. As I hit the mass of it, whatever it was, everything that hit my windshield left a smear of what looked like some kind of juice on the glass. That's when I worked out what I was driving into. It was bees. All these freaking huge bees that seriously sounded like rocks when they were slamming into my cab. I'd never seen anything like it in my life. I mean, I'd seen giant swarms of locusts on TV before, but bees? I didn't think they even swarmed like that. Two things really creeped me out about the whole thing, and not so much all the bee guts on my windshield either, because I'm not a particularly squeamish person. The first thing was how, if I'd have just been walking at the side of the road, those things might have actually killed me. A couple of 100 bee stings could easily kill a person, so I read anyway. And if they're aggressive when they're in that swarming state, that'd have been the end of me. But then the second thing, and the thing that stuck with me long after I passed through the swarm, was the idea that they'd been flying like that to avoid some epic natural disaster or something. For the next few miles, I found myself getting really anxious, half expecting to feel an earthquake or see a meteor falling from the sky or something. Obviously nothing like that happened, thank God, but the first chance I could, I looked up giant bee swarms on Google to see if they were actually a thing. Obviously they are, but ones that size are an extremely rare event. When I told another trucker about the whole thing recently, he told me I was lucky to see something like that, like it was some kind of natural wonder or something. But let me tell you, I didn't feel so lucky to be driving through it at the time. I was driving my 18-wheeler on this long-haul stretch one time when I suddenly needed to pee real bad. I figured I'd just wait for a gas station or something, but after maybe 5 or 10 minutes of driving, there was no sign of any, and no signs to tell me if I was close to one or not. So, to save from soaking my drawers, I decided to pull over and take a leak at the side of the road. It was incredibly dark outside, and although the side of the road I stopped on had a bunch of woods in it, I'll admit it was way too spooky for me to just wander off into the dark. And being as dark as it was, I figured I'd be able to just put my hazard lights on and take a few steps to the side before whipping it out. Then, right as I'm peeing, I hear something running through the trees toward me. I mean, whatever it was pounding dirt as it came at me. I couldn't see a freaking thing, and it scared the life out of me even more. So I tried to stop peeing, put my junk away, and then just bolted back to my truck cab as quickly as I could. I half expected whatever it was to slam itself up against the door of my truck, and since I keep a gun in my glove box, the first thing I did was grab it and then aim it right towards the window, getting ready to blast the first thing I saw. It felt like I was lying there on the seat for like half an hour, but in reality, it was maybe only a minute or two, and absolutely nothing appeared at the window or banged up against the door of my truck. I know it was dumb of me, but I spent the next few minutes looking out of the driver's side window, checking for whatever it was I heard running. But again, I didn't see anything. That was about the same time I realised that I hadn't actually stopped peeing when I thought I did. And in the process of putting it away and diving into my truck, I soaked the entirety of my pants and seat. I spent the next few miles driving back buck naked from the waist down, with my pants hung over the air conditioner trying to dry them before the next rest stop. Definitely one of my worst nights ever on the job, and for more than one reason too. So this might not be the most terrifying story you'll have ever heard, but I'm pretty sure you understand why I found this so creepy. I drive trucks for a living, and this one morning, I'm cruising down this stretch of highway during the summer. It was early enough for the sun to be up and incredibly bright. When I come around this one bend in the road, all I see in front of me on the blacktop was blood. Blood, guts, crushed bones, and fur. I mean, it was a massacre out there. It must have been like 100 small animals bleeding all over the road for maybe a quarter mile, and I ain't never seen anything like that in my life. Looked like the set of a horror movie or something. Later I found out that some science place had been raided by animal rights protesters or something, who let out all these minks or ferrets or whatever in the middle of the night. The poor things booked it through a forest, across a field, and then onto a busy stretch of highway. Boom, 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 they're running back and forth getting crushed by cars. Must have been a few of them coming thick and fast, because I can't see how they got so many at one time, before all of them things just scattered and got their butts off the road. But good God, I suppose the road to hell really is paved with good intentions. From 1975 to 1990, the American Southlands was stalked by one of the most abhorrent and vicious killers the country has ever known. He's thought to have tortured, violated, and murdered more than 50 different women and girls during his grotesque 15-year spree. While many other killers would have been apprehended long before they reached such a body count, the secret to this killer's success was his mobility. You see, not only was he constantly on the move using his 16-wheeler truck, but he also converted his soundproofed sleeper cab into a veritable torture chamber. This is the story of Robert Ben Rhodes, perhaps better known as the Truck Stop Killer. Born on November 22, 1945, in Council Bluffs, Iowa, Rhodes's formative years set him apart from most serial killers due to their relative normalcy. Although his father was a serving soldier in West Germany until his elementary school years, Rhodes's childhood seems to be objectively stable and wholesome. He was never abused, he never acted out, and by his teenage years, whatever trouble he got into was generally characteristic of a regular angsty teen. He was active and outgoing during his high school years, taking part in sports such as football and wrestling. He even regularly attended the Thomas Jefferson High School French Club and was apparently a rather proficient francophone. The aforementioned trouble involved juvenile arrests for public fighting and vehicle tampering, but I'm sure we can all agree that very few young men make it through their teenage years without getting into the occasional scuffle. It seems that darkness only entered Rhodes's life in 1964, the same year he enlisted in the US Marines. It was around this time that his father was suddenly arrested by Council Bluffs police, and the local community was stunned when they learned it was on charges of inappropriately touching a 12-year-old girl. Then, just when it seemed that the situation couldn't get any worse, Rhodes's father took his own life before he could be tried. Following his father's suicide, Rhodes entered something of a downward spiral, and his military conduct worsened to the point where, in 1968, he was dishonourably discharged from the military for his involvement in a violent robbery. During the years that followed, Rhodes's existence was marred by his inability to settle into any kind of routine lifestyle. He briefly attended college, but quickly dropped out. He then applied to join the Council Bluffs police force, but had his application rejected due to his dishonourable discharge from the military. He subsequently found work in a variety of stores, supermarkets, warehouses and restaurants, marrying and divorcing 3 different women in the process. One of these women, Deborah, recalls that Rhodes became horribly abusive once the flame of their romance burned out, and she found herself constantly rebuffing his attempts to introduce sadistic and masochistic activities to their relationship. Eventually, Rhodes found a form of employment that he could finally settle on, one that would take him far away from Iowa, all the pain, torment and shame of his father's despicable inclinations, long-haul trucking. Rhodes later stated that he had been preying on hitchhikers and truck stop escorts since the mid-1970s, but due to his mobility, he didn't come to the attention of authorities until 1990. It was in January of that year that Rhodes happened across a husband and wife hitchhiker couple named Patricia Walsh and Douglas Ziskowski. Patricia and Douglas had been hitchhiking across the state of Texas, and by all accounts had experienced a pleasant journey thus far. They had no reason to be suspicious of Rhodes, who seemed perfectly affable when he first stopped to pick them up. Yet shortly after they continued along the highway, the couple's nightmare began in earnest. It's not clear how Douglas was murdered, but when his body was found in Texas's Sutton County, it would not be positively identified until 2 years later. In the week that followed her husband's murder, Patricia Walsh was kept alive for 7 long days before she was finally killed. In that time, police suspect she was essentially used as a pleasure slave, kept bound and gagged in Rhodes's soundproof sleeper cab, and repeatedly tortured until he grew bored of her. Her body was then dumped in Millard County, Utah, and by the time her body found its way onto a coroner's table, she was barely recognizable. A month later, Rhodes snatched 18-year-old Shauna Holtz from the side of the highway, bundling her into his makeshift torture chamber where she was tortured and kept prisoner for around 2 weeks. Miraculously, Shauna managed to escape captivity and immediately rushed to inform law enforcement of her harrowing ordeal. She gave the police a detailed description of both Rhodes and the truck he was driving, and this led to the speedy detention of her attacker. However, when faced with actually pressing charges against Rhodes, Shauna suddenly began to have second thoughts. She told investigating police officers that she didn't think a jury would believe her story, and even when assured that the mountain of evidence would ensure a conviction, she refused to appear in court. "I don't see any good in filing charges," she said on record. "It's just going to be my word against his. If there was any evidence, I would file charges and sue him." Shauna was once again shown the massive amounts of collated evidence and was told not a jury in the land would decline to convict Rhodes of his heinous and brutal actions, but still, she declined a court appearance. It's now believed that Shauna found the combination of fear and trauma to be completely and utterly psychologically overwhelming. She may have believed that if cleared of the charges, Rhodes would hunt her down to subject her to more of the same awful treatment, and if he did, she might not be fortunate enough to escape for a second time. 2 weeks after the kidnapping charges against Rhodes were dropped, 2 teenage runaways named Ricky Lee Jones and Regina K. Walters were attempting to hitchhike out of the Houston suburb of Pasadena. Rhodes spotted them, put on his facade of friendliness, and as the young couple climbed into the cab of his truck, their fate was sealed. Just like with Patricia Walsh and Douglas Ziskowski, Ricky Lee Jones was murdered almost straight away, with his body being found on March 3, 1991, in Lamar County, Mississippi. Regina Walters was told she'd suffer the same fate unless she complied. The kidnapping of Regina Kay is perhaps the most viscerally disturbing of Rhodes's murders, because in this case, there exists actual photographic evidence of his victim's final moments. The police would later seize photographs from Rhodes's home that depicted Regina Walters and other victims being forced to stand and sit in painful stress positions. These photographs are extremely disturbing, as the horror etched into their faces is palpable. In Regina's case, the images show her having differing hair lengths, with a variety of different bruises, suggesting that she had been held captive for a very long time, possibly even months. In addition to physical abuse and psychological torture, Regina was subjected to Robert Ben Rhodes's cruel taunts in a series of anonymous phone calls to her father in the months after he kidnapped her. Rhodes would call his home or office and say things like, "I made some changes, I cut her hair." During one phone call, Regina's father asked Rhodes to at least tell him if his daughter was alive or not. Rhodes reportedly responded with, "Oh, she's alive all right. I've left her hung up in a barn somewhere, but you'll never find her." It was a lie. By the time the phone call was made, Regina was dead, killed in a manner that is almost too sickening to recount. On the day of her execution, Regina was taken to a derelict piece of farmland where there existed a rotting, dilapidated shack. Rhodes had cut her long flowing curls short, forced her into a long black dress and heels, then told her to pose as if he was about to attack her. The photos Rhodes took of her that day are easy to find online, and it's possible that she was assured that she would be safe if she only complied with the request. It was a lie. Once Rhodes had finished taking photographs of Regina in her meek and awkward poses, he wrapped a piece of metal wire around her neck, then strangled the life out of her. Thankfully, Rhodes would be apprehended a short while later, denying him the chance to kill again. But it was undeniably a frighteningly close call for his latest prospective victim. On the early morning of April 1st, 1990, Arizona Highway Patrol Trooper Mike Miller discovered a truck with its hazard lights on at the side of the interstate. Deciding to stop to see if the driver needed any assistance, Miller parked his patrol car at the edge of the road, then got out to investigate. When he drew level with the truck's sleeper cab, he heard a faint sound coming from inside. Then, when he opened the small hatch, he was greeted by an ear-splitting scream. Inside was a naked and bloodied Kathleen Vine, whose arms were restrained by a pair of handcuffs which had been grafted to the ceiling of the sleeper cab. When Rhodes emerged from the driver's seat of the truck, he told the horrified Trooper Miller that he had simply found Kathleen at the side of the highway like that, and was in the process of seeking help for her. Thankfully, Miller didn't buy Rhodes's ruse, and the officer drew his gun on him, disarming and arresting him in the process. It was only when Rhodes was in police custody that a homicide detective was able to connect him to a string of disappearances across America's southern states, and not long after, a charge of murder was added to an already extensive list of offences including aggravated assault and unlawful imprisonment. It wasn't until 1994 that Rhodes was convicted of the murder of Regina Kay Walters, and as punishment, he was sentenced to life without parole at Menard Correctional Center in Chester, Illinois. Just over a decade later, he was extradited to Utah to be tried for the deaths of Candace Walsh and Douglas Ziskowski. The charges were dropped after the families of the victims claimed that testifying in court would be far too painful to bear. They were reassured that Rhodes was about to be extradited to Texas to be tried for the murder of Ricky Lee Jones, and in this case, Rhodes pleaded guilty to his death in exchange for a second life sentence, ensuring he would never again see the light of day. Rhodes is now 76 years old, and is still detained at the Menard Maximum Security Prison, but although he has previously claimed as many as 50 victims, authorities have said it's unlikely he'll ever stand trial again. That means it's impossible to know just how many missing people Rhodes is responsible for, and there are scores of families across Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi and Utah who will never truly know what happened to their loved ones. It's also not entirely clear why Rhodes chose to kill in the first place. Perhaps it all stems from the anger and shame he felt regarding his father's deviance and eventually him taking his own life. Killing the innocent may have been his way of getting back at the world that he felt had wronged him while he was still in the prime of his life. The only thing we know for certain is that Rhodes was imbued with a rare distilled variety of evil that led him not only to torture those he would go on to kill, but also to reach out and torture their families as well. Hey friends, thank you for listening to today's story. Make sure to click the notification icon to stay updated on all future narrations. I release new videos twice every day at 10 AM and 8 PM Eastern Time. If you have a story to share, please send it to the email displayed on the screen. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like and leave an encouraging comment. It really helps me keep bringing you more narrations like this. If you'd like to support the channel even more, you can get early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.